Bavarian mansion, requisitioned and repurposed, stood sentinel against the grey dawn of 1943. Within, a woman, her hair the colour of ripened wheat, laboured under the cold gaze of SS observers. Her cries were muted, swallowed by the thick stone walls. Her future already forfeit. The child she birthed was not her own, not truly. She would never know its name, its face, its fate. The father, a phantom, forever beyond her grasp. This scene, repeated countless times, was not an anomaly, a rogue act of wartime brutality. It was a calculated manoeuvre, a brushstroke in the grotesque portrait of the Third Reich's ambition, the Lebensborn. More than a mere sanctuary for unmarried mothers, the Lebensborn program, conceived in the twisted imagination of Heinrich Himmler, Reich leader of the SS, represented a chilling experiment in applied eugenics. Imagine, if you will, a human farm where bloodlines were meticulously catalogued, where reproduction was a tool of state, and where the very essence of humanity was reduced to a set of quantifiable traits. This wasn't about welfare. It was about war, a war waged on the genetic frontier. It was about reshaping the very fabric of humankind according to a perverse ideology. The program, veiled in the deceptive language of social care, involved acts so heinous they defy easy comprehension. The systematic violation of women, the callous theft of infants, biological experimentation that blurred the line between science and barbarity, the erasure of identities, replaced with fabricated histories and manufactured loyalties. Thousands of women were reduced to mere vessels, incubators for the Reich's master race. Hundreds of thousands of children were severed from their families, their heritage, their very selves, recast as nameless cogs in an ideological machine of unprecedented scale. How far did this insidious project truly extend? What horrors lurked behind the pristine facade of the Lebensborn homes? Today, we begin to unravel the threads of this diabolical scheme, to delve into the dark heart of the source of life, to understand how the Third Reich attempted to redesign humanity, one carefully selected birth at a time. We will explore the chilling calculus that placed race above reason, the chilling indifference that saw children as commodities, and the enduring legacy of a program that sought to engineer a future built on genetic purity, a future that thankfully never came to pass. Yet, its shadow lingers, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the seductive allure of a world built on the false promise of racial superiority. As Germany rose from the ashes of the First World War, reclaiming its military might and economic dominance, a far more insidious project was quietly taking root, an ambition conceived in the darkest corners of the Nazi ideology. The Lebensborn program, its very name whispering of renewal and promise, was officially inaugurated on December the 12th, 1935, under the direct and unwavering control of Heinrich Himmler, the Reich leader of the SS, the man who would become synonymous with the regime's most brutal excesses. This initiative wasn't merely a policy, it was the tangible manifestation of a racial obsession, a belief system that elevated biology above law, blood above all human considerations. Himmler, a man consumed by a fanatical belief in Aryan supremacy, possessed a peculiar, unsettling background. Before ascending to the pinnacle of power, he had been a poultry breeder, meticulously selecting and cultivating specific traits in his flock. He transferred these principles of genetic selection, this cold, clinical approach to life itself, to the human domain. Selective breeding, the systematic elimination of undesirable characteristics, the amplification of traits deemed superior, these were the tenets of his vision, a vision of a future populated by a master race, strong, pure, and unyielding. While publicly presented as a charitable endeavour, a benevolent organisation dedicated to assisting single mothers in need, the Lebensborn's true purpose was far more sinister: to establish a system of controlled reproduction, a carefully orchestrated breeding program designed to perpetuate what Nazi ideologues defined as Aryan blood. The program's foundation lay in the pseudo-scientific racial theories that had swept through Europe in the 19th century, theories that purported to classify humanity into a rigid hierarchy. At the apex of this imaginary scale stood the so-called Nordic race, a construct defined by superficial physical characteristics, light skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. The Nazi regime elevated this spurious taxonomy to the level of state doctrine. In German schools, these racist notions were presented as irrefutable scientific truths, shaping the minds of an entire generation. Citizens were compelled to prove their Aryan purity by producing genealogical certificates, a Nenachweise, meticulously tracing their lineage back to 1800, a task fraught with difficulty and often based on flimsy evidence. To gain entry into the SS, the elite corps upon which the Lebensborn program depended, the racial requirements were even more stringent. Prospective members underwent detailed physical examinations, their features scrutinized, their phenotypes assessed with unsettling precision. Motherhood was recast as a patriotic duty, a sacred obligation to the Reich. In 1938, the regime instituted the German Mother's Cross of Honor, an award bestowed upon women based solely on the number of children they bore. Bronze for 4 or 5, silver for 6 or 7, and gold for 8 or more. These mothers were showered with material privileges and hailed as biological heroes of the Reich, their wombs serving as the foundation of its future. Propaganda relentlessly propagated images of blonde, blue-eyed mothers surrounded by healthy children while simultaneously demonizing or erasing representations of professional women, independent women, women who dared to exist outside the narrow confines of the prescribed maternal role. The Lebensborn's institutional structure mirrored the Nazi regime's obsession with control and hierarchy. Every aspect of the reproductive process was placed under the watchful eye of the state, from the selection of candidates to the moment of conception, from childbirth to early childhood education. Human life, from its very genesis, became the property of the Reich, and the female body, a territory to be administered by the National Socialist state, a resource to be exploited in the name of racial purity. The Lebensborn program did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of years of increasingly radical policies aimed at shaping the biological destiny of the German people. Since 1933, with the enactment of the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, the Nazi regime had implemented a program of forced sterilization, targeting individuals deemed genetically inferior. Over 400,000 people deemed undesirable were subjected to this horrific procedure. People with physical or mental disabilities, the chronically ill, alcoholics, and those classified as asocial, a broad and vaguely defined category that encompassed anyone who deviated from the regime's narrow definition of acceptable behavior. This negative eugenics, the attempt to prevent the reproduction of those deemed undesirable, found its counterpart in the Lebensborn, a program designed to actively encourage the reproduction of those deemed desirable. The two policies, seemingly opposite in their approach, were inextricably linked, two sides of the same coin: the relentless pursuit of racial purity, the unwavering belief in the possibility of engineering a superior human race. Rudolf Brandt, Himmler's personal secretary and one of the program's key administrative architects, documented in internal memos the fundamentally instrumental view held by those involved in the Lebensborn. In a chilling document dated March 1936, he wrote, "The motherhood of worthy blood is not a private matter for mothers, but a duty to the state and a guarantee of the nation's eternity." This text, later recovered by researchers, reveals the dehumanizing perspective that lay beneath the flowery rhetoric of maternal honor. Women were not valued as individuals but as instruments, their bodies serving as tools in the service of the Reich. The Lebensborn operated as a specialized branch within the complex and sprawling Nazi racial apparatus. The Ahnenerbe and the Society for Research and Teaching on German Ancestral Heritage provided the pseudo-scientific justification for the program, lending it a veneer of academic respectability. The Russia, the SS Central Office for Race and Resettlement, implemented racial classification policies determining who was worthy of inclusion in the Lebensborn and who was not. The Lebensborn itself was specifically tasked with the production of human resources, the creation of a new generation of Aryan warriors and mothers. This racial machinery operated with the bureaucratic precision so characteristic of the Third Reich. Every form, every medical evaluation, every decision regarding maternity was meticulously documented with chilling administrative coldness. The program received diversified funding, a testament to its strategic importance in the eyes of the regime. Although formally presented as an associative entity, the Eingetragene Verein Lebensbornerwies, registered association, Lebensborn, it received direct funding from the SS, financial contributions from all SS officers who were required to pay monthly dues based on their rank, corporate donations from corporations seeking political favour, and covert state subsidies. This complex financial structure guaranteed the program operational autonomy and a high degree of discretion over its actual activities, allowing it to operate largely outside the purview of traditional oversight mechanisms. The implementation of the Lebensborn marked a critical turning point in the history of modern biopolitics. For the first time, a developed state systematically attempted to control not only who could reproduce, but also how, when, and for what specific purpose. This fusion of demographic policy, racial ideology, and reproductive control would set disturbing precedents that would transcend the military defeat of Nazism, leaving a dark stain on the 20th century and serving as a cautionary tale for future generations. The Lebensborn homes, strategically positioned throughout Germany and later across occupied Europe, represented the architectural embodiment of Nazi racial ideology. From the exterior they often appeared innocuous, resembling private clinics or converted mansions, typically nestled in idyllic rural settings, far from the prying eyes of the general population. The first such facility opened in 1936 in Steinhöring, Bavaria. By 1944, at least 30 homes were operating across Germany and the occupied territories, primarily in converted mansions, castles, or sanatoriums. Admission to a Lebensborn home was strictly controlled, restricted to women who had successfully navigated a rigorous selection process. The initial filter was genealogical. The candidate was required to provide irrefutable proof of her pure Aryan ancestry, tracing her lineage back to at least 1800 by presenting a complete Ernennachweis. Officials from the SS Race and Settlement Office meticulously examined these family trees, discarding any applicants with Jewish, Slavic, or non-European ancestors, no matter how distant. Once this requirement was satisfied, a series of exhaustive medical and physical examinations followed. The woman had to be free of hereditary diseases or racial defects. Facial symmetry, cranial shape, and general body structure were evaluated with meticulous precision, with preference given to blondes with blue eyes, conforming to the Nazi ideal of the Nordic type. Finally, the candidate's political and moral profile was scrutinized, assessing her membership in National Socialist organizations and her overall reputation. The participating men, primarily SS officers, also underwent similar screening processes. Himmler decreed that every member of the SS had to demonstrate racial purity through genealogical documents, physical tests, and behavioral evaluations. The masculine ideal included tall stature, athletic build, Nordic features, and absolute ideological loyalty to the regime. In many cases, pregnancy occurred through prearranged encounters between selected women and SS officers, acts of procreation carefully orchestrated and devoid of genuine emotional connection. These encounters were based on meticulously calculated reproductive planning, utilizing ovulatory calendars and medical interventions to ensure optimal conditions for fertilization. The participants often remained anonymous, treating the sexual act as a patriotic service, a contribution to the future of the Reich. Once pregnant, women were admitted to the Lebensborn homes, where they received constant medical monitoring. Dedicated medical teams tracked every aspect of the pregnancy: weight, blood pressure, fetal development, and psychological status. Pregnant women were isolated from the outside world, receiving no unauthorized visitors, and many were kept in the dark about whether they would ever see their children again after birth. Births were meticulously documented, each stage timed and recorded. Some births were intentionally performed without anesthesia, a twisted glorification of female suffering, presented as a testament to the strength and resilience of Aryan women. Immediately after birth, the baby underwent racial assessment, its physical characteristics measured and recorded in minute detail, transforming the newborn into statistical data within the framework of the eugenics project. Traditional Christian baptism was replaced with pagan Germanic ceremonies designed by Himmler himself. These rituals included drinking water from sacred springs, chanting Norse incantations, and swearing oaths of allegiance to the Führer. Names of ancient Germanic origin, such as Siegfried or Brunhilde, were imposed instead of traditional Christian names, further stripping the children of their individuality and imbuing them with a fabricated sense of heritage. After giving birth, many mothers never saw their children again. The newborns were immediately taken into state care, their fates determined by the dictates of racial ideology. The babies were sent to special orphanages, designated homes for SS families, or National Socialist educational institutions, where they would be raised according to the principles of Nazi indoctrination. Those who passed the initial racial test began their ideological training from the cradle, taught obedience, racial supremacy, and Germanic pride. Between 1936 and 1945, it is estimated that approximately 20,000 to 30,000 children were born under the Lebensborn program, most of them in Germany and Norway, but also in Austria, Poland, France, and other occupied territories, scattered across Europe like seeds sown in the name of a twisted and ultimately doomed vision. Daily life within a Lebensborn home adhered to an almost monastic regime, meticulously designed to create an environment that combined elements of a hospital, an ideological school, and a closed community. The day commenced early with specific physical exercises for pregnant women, developed by SS doctors. These exercises, meticulously documented in internal manuals recovered after the war, aimed to strengthen the maternal body while simultaneously instilling military discipline. The diet was meticulously planned according to peculiar racial principles. Foods deemed authentically Germanic, whole grain rye bread, milk, honey, pork, and root vegetables were favoured, while foreign or degenerate products such as coffee, exotic spices, or processed foods were strictly avoided. Wartime rationing, which severely impacted the common German population, did not apply to these facilities, which received priority supplies directly from the SS, ensuring that the pregnant women and newborn babies were adequately nourished, at least in terms of physical sustenance. The Lebensborn homes reflected the disturbing fusion of medical functionality and ideological symbolism. Margaret Heidemann, a nurse who worked at the Bad Polzin home in present-day Poland, testified years later, describing how the rooms combined modern hospital equipment with runic symbols, portraits of the Führer, and Nordic-inspired furniture. Every detail, from the lighting to the arrangement of the beds, was carefully orchestrated to reinforce the idea of participation in a momentous historical project, a grand endeavour to reshape the future of the German race. The constant presence of doctors, nurses, and administrative staff created an atmosphere of perpetual surveillance. Participants were continually evaluated, not only physically, but also ideologically and psychologically. Detailed records were meticulously kept of their behaviour, attitudes, and comments. Those who displayed doubt, criticism, or insufficient enthusiasm could be expelled from the programme or, in more serious cases, face disciplinary consequences. The psychological dimension of the Lebensborn project has been less extensively documented than its biological aspects, but later testimonies reveal systematic techniques of emotional manipulation. Women were simultaneously elevated as mothers of the nation, celebrated as the biological saviours of the Reich, while being denied basic autonomy and freedom of thought. This inherent contradiction, being simultaneously indispensable yet expendable, honourable yet controlled, generated a psychological dependence on the institution, hindering individual resistance. Ingeborg Weber, one of the few participants to leave a written testimony, recovered only in 1987, described the environment as a gilded prison where we were treated like precious but hollow vessels. This description encapsulates the fundamental duality of the program. It offered protection, food, and medical care in a time of war, but at the cost of turning participants into passive components of a large-scale social experiment. Ideological indoctrination was a central component of the daily routine. During pregnancy, women received classes in racial theory, Germanic studies, Norse mythology, and history reinterpreted according to the National Socialist worldview. These training seminars, conducted by female SS members or designated teachers, sought to ensure that the mothers, even if they did not raise their children themselves, would instill the proper worldview in them during the crucial period of gestation. A distinctive aspect of the Lebensborn program was its pioneering use of genetic testing. Although rudimentary by today's standards, it represented cutting-edge technology in the 1930s and 1940s. Blood types, hereditary characteristics, and genetic predispositions were analysed using techniques specifically developed by researchers associated with the program. This data was stored in biological archives, intended for use in future selective breeding initiatives, underscoring the long-term vision of this eugenics project. Bureaucratic precision reached extraordinary levels in relation to newborns. Each baby received a Lebensborn Laufkarte, Lebensborn vital file, that included not only their physical characteristics, but also their racial potential, assessed according to pseudoscientific scales developed by the Russia. This documentation determined their immediate fate. Those deemed valuable, or very valuable, were entered into the elitist adoption program, destined for placement within the families of high-ranking SS officers or other prominent members of the Nazi elite. Those deemed acceptable remained in institutional nurseries, awaiting further assessment or eventual placement in foster families. Those deemed dubious were progressively marginalised, their future uncertain, their potential for integration into the Volksgemeinschaft, national community, severely limited. Beneath the carefully constructed facade of social assistance that Nazi propaganda erected around the Lebensborn, a system of structural violence operated, where the female body functioned as a mere resource at the service of a vast racial machine. Women who voluntarily entered the program often did so under a complex interplay of deception, social pressure, and economic necessity. Others, particularly in occupied territories, were forced to participate without their consent, becoming victims of systematic violation at the hands of German officers. The program also involved the mass abduction of children with physical characteristics deemed racially valuable, a practice that ripped families apart and shattered countless lives. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Lebensborn was its ability to normalise violation as a political tool. In Germany, sexual relations within the program were presented as voluntary, but this categorisation ignores the coercive context in which they occurred. Women were isolated from their surroundings, placed under the absolute authority of the SS, and exposed to constant ideological pressures, eroding their ability to make genuinely free choices. In occupied territories such as Norway and France, the line between consensual and forced relationships became even more blurred. Thousands of women were pressured by German soldiers to engage in sexual activity in exchange for protection, food, or privileges under military occupation. In Poland, where resistance to the German occupation was particularly fierce, the Lebensborn program resulted in the brutal appropriation of the female body. Young women were captured, racially evaluated, and held against their will to be impregnated. These violations were not isolated acts of individual brutality, but rather a calculated state policy aimed at producing Aryan offspring in territories that the Reich planned to biologically colonize. Internal SS documentation described pregnancy as a purely biological function of national interest, transforming women into mere instruments whose will was deemed irrelevant. Refusal to participate could result in severe reprisals, loss of food rations, physical violence, deportation, or even internment in concentration camps. Beginning in 1941, under direct orders from Himmler, the SS initiated an operation to identify, kidnap, and Germanize children who met Nazi racial criteria. Lebensborn. Officials deployed specialized teams to schools, orphanages, and rural communities to select children with Nordic characteristics. These children were forcibly removed from their families without explanation or legal process. Many were torn from their parents' arms at train stations or during nighttime raids. Those who passed the initial racial tests were sent to Germany, where they received a new identity, a Germanic name, assumed German nationality, and placement in Lebensborn homes or carefully selected foster families. There they learned German, were forbidden to speak their native language, and underwent intensive National Socialist indoctrination. Children who failed the racial screening or actively resisted Germanization faced tragic fates. Many were interned in children's concentration camps, such as the one in Łódź, Litzmannstadt, where they were subjected to medical experiments, forced labor, or extermination through lethal injections or starvation. It is estimated that at least 200,000 children were abducted in Poland alone, although the actual number could be even higher. Children were also captured in Czechoslovakia, Slovenia, Ukraine, and other occupied territories, their lives irrevocably altered, their identities erased. Child theft constituted a form of identity murder, stripping these young victims of their language, family history, culture, and origins. Many grew up completely unaware of their true nationality, their past deliberately obscured by the machinations of the Nazi regime. Germanization included a systematic process of ideological reprogramming that began with name changes and continued with the total obliteration of memories through physical and psychological punishment. Vera Gran, a Polish girl kidnapped at the age of 5 and raised in Germany under another name, only realized after the war that her real parents had perished in Treblinka. "My childhood was a lie," she declared years later. "They tore out my tongue, my memory, my mother." The Recovery of Valuable Blood program, a euphemistic term used in official documents to describe child abduction, operated through a complex network of interconnected institutions, each playing a crucial role in the process of racial selection and forced assimilation. The process of identifying and abducting children deemed racially valuable began with the Rassenprüfer, the racial examiners, officials with anthropological training who toured occupied territories, particularly rural areas of Poland and Ukraine, where, according to Nazi racial theories, descendants of ancient Germanic settlements with uncontaminated Nordic blood could be found. These examiners employed a meticulous classification system developed by Professor Eugen Fischer of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Genetics and Eugenics. The scale included 62 measurable physical characteristics, from facial angle to the shape of the earlobes, scored using a complex numerical system. The children being evaluated received grades ranging from 1 to 11, with 1 to 4 signifying racially worthy, 5 to 6 acceptable, and 7 to 11 racially undesirable. According to documented testimony presented at the Nuremberg trials, these evaluations often lasted only a few minutes per child, frequently taking place in local schools using intimidating methods. Maria Nowak, a Czech teacher at a rural school near Lidis, a village infamous for its destruction in retaliation for the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, documented how this process unfolded. They arrived unannounced one January morning in 1943, 3 men in uniform and a woman in a white coat. They ordered all the children to be lined up in the courtyard. They took measurements, photographs, hair samples. 2 weeks later, 11 children were missing. The families received official letters stating that they had been selected for special education. Those children, deemed racially worthy, were sent to Germanization centers in areas such as Deutsch-Lisse near Wrocław, or Gombin, where any trace of their original identity was systematically eliminated. Testimony from survivors such as Roman Witasek, recovered by the Polish Historical Commission in 1947, describes these facilities. We were forced to stay awake in front of posters with German phrases until we memorized them. Anyone who spoke Polish was beaten. After 3 months, we didn't recognize our own brothers. We had been turned into strangers. Particularly shocking was the fate of identical twins, who were especially valued in Nazi eugenics programs. Under the direction of Dr. Josef Mengele at Auschwitz, but with documented links to the Lebensborn program, numerous pairs of twins with valuable racial characteristics were deliberately separated. One sent for medical experimentation, the other to German families as part of nature versus nurture studies. This separation, documented by researchers such as Dr. Yehuda Bauer, exemplifies the extreme instrumentalization of childhood under the Nazi regime. Ulrich Greifeld, a senior Russia officer later tried at Nuremberg, admitted in an internal memorandum dated September 1942, recovered from Soviet archives, that child relocation contributes doubly to the cause. It eliminates the future reproductive potential of the enemy, while strengthening our own demographic base. This quote reveals the underlying logic. Child abduction was not simply forced adoption, but a deliberate strategy of long-term demographic genocide, aimed at eradicating entire cultures and replacing them with a racially pure population. Sexual violence, wielded as a biopolitical weapon, reached particularly disturbing proportions in the occupied territories of the East. In areas designated as German resettlement areas, primarily Western Poland and parts of Ukraine, special units combined sexual violence with racial selection. According to documented testimony by Polish historian Czesław Madajczyk, there were facilities such as Helenovec, where young Slavic women with valuable racial characteristics were systematically violated by selected officers. The resulting pregnant women were transferred to Lebensborn homes if the unborn child was deemed racially valuable. Otherwise, they were sent to labour camps, their lives deemed expendable. Hormone experiments were another poorly documented aspect of the programme. At some Lebensborn facilities, particularly the one in Pernitz, Austria, SS doctors such as Walter Starr experimented with hormone treatments to increase fertility, accelerate physical development in children, or even attempt to influence the sex of future babies. These experiments, documented in fragments in archives captured by the Soviet military and only partially declassified in the 1990s, demonstrate the extent to which the program combined population policies with biomedical research, operating without any ethical restrictions. The appropriation of children also had a revealing economic dimension. According to recovered administrative records, German families who adopted Germanized children had to pay between 750 and 1,500 Reichsmarks to the Lebensborn administration. This commercialization of abducted children generated substantial revenue for the program, effectively creating a racially based adoption market where Nordic characteristics determined the price. The Lebensborn program, born on German soil, soon transcended the borders of the Reich to become a key instrument of biological colonization throughout Europe. As the German army advanced, the Nazi ideological apparatus transformed each conquered territory into a demographic resource to be exploited according to racial criteria. Himmler envisioned the expansion of the Lebensborn as a means of fundamentally redesigning the European human map, replacing inferior populations with racially pure Germans. Norway, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Austria became key locations for this unprecedented operation. Austria was the first territory to be integrated into the Lebensborn program after the Anschluss in 1938. Since it was considered an integral part of Greater Germany, the establishment of Lebensborn homes required no additional legal justification. Schloss Spittel and a Drau, on the outskirts of Vienna, became a key institution in the program. Although officially operating as a children's hospital, covert medical experiments, euthanasia, and racial classification were carried out there. The Austrian population, predominantly Germanic, provided an immediate source of potential mothers for the program. Thousands of Austrian women were recruited, while children who did not meet the stringent racial standards were eliminated or sent to re-education institutions. Norway, with its population exhibiting prominent Nordic traits, was identified by Himmler as an ideal territory for German genetic expansion. Following the occupation in 1940, the program established maternity and adoption centres in Oslo, Bergen, and Trondheim. More than 12,000 children were born from relationships between Norwegian women and German soldiers during the occupation. The Norwegian children were carefully evaluated by SS doctors, and if they met the prescribed racial criteria, many were sent to Germany for complete Germanization. In France, the Lebensborn program took on seemingly more subtle forms. Paris and other major cities were the scenes of organized seduction operations. German officers were instructed to establish relationships with local women who displayed desirable racial characteristics. Secret clinics were established in regions with a significant historical German presence, such as Alsace and Lorraine. From there, children were transported to Germany for racial assessment and subsequent placement with selected families. This process included document falsification, Germanization of surnames, and the creation of completely fictitious biographies. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the Lebensborn operated with less institutional visibility, but with intense ideological activity. In the Netherlands, where collaborationism was most prevalent, approximately 5,000 relationships between Dutch women and German soldiers were recorded. In Belgian territory, where the occupation was often more violent, child abductions were more frequent. Lebensborn. Teams operated in hospitals, churches, and orphanages, identifying blonde or light-eyed children who could pass for German. In all these countries, the Germanization process followed a systematic protocol. Racial identification through medical evaluation, family separation, change of identity with new first names, surnames, and German nationality, re-education in National Socialist schools with punishments for using the native language, and finally, adoption by German families with no possibility of contact with their past. The German defeat in 1945 led to the collapse of the Lebensborn system, but the victims, especially the Germanized children in occupied countries, were trapped in a legal and emotional limbo. Many adoptive families refused to return the children. The program's files were partially destroyed by the SS to avoid legal liability, and most of these children grew up without ever knowing their true identity. The Lebensborn children faced constant social rejection. They were perceived as children of the enemy and a product of national humiliation. Some ended up in psychiatric institutions, others in punitive orphanages. It was only in the 1990s that systematic research into these events began, driven by historians, human rights organizations, and associations of victims. Some countries, such as Norway, offered public apologies, while in others, such as France, the subject remains partially taboo in official historical memory. The implementation of the Lebensborn program in Norway presents particular characteristics that illuminate the strategic adaptation of the program to local conditions. After the invasion in April 1940, Reichskommissar Josef Terboven and the collaborationist Vidkun Quisling established a regulatory framework that facilitated relationships between German soldiers and Norwegian women. The Richtlinien über deutsch-norwegische Beziehungen, Guidelines on German-Norwegian Relations, issued in August 1940, explicitly stated that relations between German soldiers and Norwegian women should be encouraged as a contribution to Nordic unification. The Lebensbornheim in Godeset, on the outskirts of Oslo, was the first established outside German territory. Located in a former aristocratic mansion, this facility catered exclusively to Norwegian women pregnant with German soldiers. According to documentation recovered from the Riksarkivet, the Norwegian National Archives, this home received special funding directly from Himmler's office, demonstrating the strategic importance the regime placed on the recovery of Nordic blood. What was distinctive about the Norwegian case was the creation of a specific administrative structure, the Abteilung Lebensborn Department, directly under the German Reichskommissar but partially staffed by collaborationist Norwegian officials. This hybrid structure allowed for more effective social penetration, utilizing local networks and local knowledge to identify potential participants. Gaute Schwan, the chief administrator of this department, wrote in a 1942 internal report, "Norway represents our most fertile ground. Here, Germanic blood has remained purer than in Germany itself. Internal statistical reports reveal that approximately 40% of Norwegian participants entered the program out of direct economic need, 30% due to social pressure or effective propaganda, and only 20% due to genuine ideological conviction. The remaining 10% entered through varying degrees of direct coercion. This demographic composition partly explains why, after the war, Norwegian society took a particularly harsh view of these women. They were perceived as opportunists or traitors, not as victims. The French case presents a very different implementation, due primarily to two factors: the more intense French cultural resistance and the Nazi racial perception, which considered the French to be partially acceptable, but not racially optimal. Program documents show that in France, the Lebensborn operated with greater secrecy, camouflaging its facilities as private clinics or retirement homes, seemingly disconnected from the German administration. Château de la Morlaix, near Paris, operated as the primary Lebensborn facility in France. Recovered archives indicate that, unlike other homes, extremely rigorous selection was practiced here. Only women with demonstrable Germanic ancestry, mainly Alsatians or descendants of historical migrations, were accepted. The remaining French women pregnant by German soldiers received temporary assistance, but their children rarely entered the selective adoption program. The implementation of the Lebensborn in the Netherlands had particularities linked to the active local collaborationist movement. The National Socialistische Beweging, NSB, the Dutch National Socialist movement, was directly involved in recruiting women for the program, presenting it as a biological bridge between Germanic peoples. Propaganda leaflets distributed in 1942, preserved in the Dutch National Archives, featured this rhetoric: "The Dutch mother who gives a child to a German soldier builds the future of Europe." A lesser-known but strategically crucial aspect was the use of the Lebensborn as a diplomatic tool in countries that were formerly allied but not occupied. In Sweden, a neutral country during the war, undercover agents of the program operated, identifying Swedish women willing to participate. These women travelled voluntarily to Lebensborn homes in Norway or Germany. Swedish diplomatic documentation declassified in 2001 reveals that the Swedish government was aware of these activities, but tolerated them to maintain its neutrality in trade relations with Germany. In Denmark, the programme's implementation followed a soft model, due to the country's peculiar political situation, which was occupied but had administrative autonomy until 1943. The main centre in Copenhagen, called the Danish Deutsches Mutter- und Kinderhilfswerk, Danish-German Mother and Child Welfare Centre, operated under the guise of a joint initiative. Recent studies by Danish historian Erik Hiest Sørensen document that approximately 6,000 children were born from relationships between Danes and Germans, many under the indirect supervision of the program. The expansion of the Lebensborn into Eastern Europe followed more aggressive patterns, directly linked to ethnic cleansing policies. In territories such as Slovenia, partially incorporated into the Reich as the province of Ljubljana, The Lebensborn functioned as a direct complement to mass deportations. Administrative documents recovered from the German Federal Archives show this correlation. Areas where Slavic populations were deported or exterminated immediately received racial settlers who included Lebensborn facilities to biologically Germanize the territory. Local resistance to the program took various forms, depending on the national context. In Norway, the Lutheran Church played a central role, publicly opposing it through pastoral letters denouncing the program as an attack on the Christian family. In France, clandestine adoption networks linked to the resistance attempted to intercept children destined for German Lebensborn homes. In Poland, the destruction of civil records by the resistance made racial identification more difficult, while clandestine instructions circulated for families to artificially darken blonde children, using natural dyes to prevent their abduction. Each national manifestation of the Lebensborn program adapted its methods to local conditions, but the ideological core remained intact: biological colonization as a natural extension of military conquest. In early 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled militarily and morally, the Lebensborn program entered its final desperate phase. The SS High Command ordered the destruction of all documentation related to the program: birth records, medical records, genealogical files, and adoption lists. The priority was obvious: erase the traces of the regime's most shameful human experiment, burying the evidence of its crimes before the world could bear witness. Those responsible understood that the world would soon discover that beneath the carefully constructed facade of social welfare lay a systematic policy of violation, abduction, medical experimentation and child manipulation perpetrated on a continental scale. In April 1945, as Allied forces liberated German and Austrian cities, the physical remnants of the Lebensborn began to surface. What they found were not concentration camps, but elegant mansions, sophisticated gynecological clinics, partially burned archives, and abandoned delivery rooms. In numerous facilities, children remained interned without documentation, without identifiable families, and without knowledge of their own identities. In places like Steinhuring and Windeck, soldiers discovered immaculate children's rooms, perfectly aligned cribs, portraits of Hitler on the walls, and National Socialist child-rearing manuals. The greatest shock was the presence of unidentified children, labelled with numbers or artificially Germanized surnames. The SS had learned from the regime's other failures. Where there was documentation of the horror, there was the possibility of prosecution. Therefore, in the final months of the war, a massive process of archival destruction and elimination of evidence was carried out. Drastic methods were employed. Some homes were dynamited, others were set ablaze, and numerous clinics were completely dismantled. This deliberate action, planned from Berlin, resulted in the permanent disappearance of approximately 70% of the program's official archives. The situation was further complicated by the division of territories among the Allied powers, who did not share all the recovered information. The Soviet Union confiscated Lebensborn archives in Austria and Czechoslovakia, which were never fully declassified, and France partially concealed its own involvement in the program. The Nuremberg trials, held between 1945 and 1946, represented the most ambitious attempt to